A new study just revealed everything that's wrong with modern progressivism. So, of course, the mainstream media is refusing to cover it. We're going to break this down and so much more on today's episode of the Brad vs. Everyone podcast, my daily show where I take on the craziest ideas from across our politics, media, and the internet, all from an independent perspective. Up first, we've got a bombshell story about a new study on diversity education efforts, DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and some of the teachings of the most prominent anti-racist activists like Robin DiAngelo and Ibram X. Kendi that totally undercuts the progressive worldview and vision for this kind of advocacy, but is being glaringly ignored by news outlets like the New York Times and Bloomberg that usually cover this kind of research. I wonder why. For more on this story, we're going to check out Reality's Last Stand, the excellent publication by friend of the show and evolutionary biologist Colin Wright, which I will link to and again encourage you to subscribe to in the description. In his report on this news, he asks, why was this groundbreaking study on DEI silenced, noting that two leading media organizations abruptly shelved coverage of a groundbreaking study that went against their narrative. Now, once you learn more about this study, it'll become pretty clear why these liberal-leaning media outlets chose not to cover it this time around, even though they usually cover research by this same institution. Colin writes that in a stunning series of events, two leading media organizations, the New York Times and Bloomberg, abruptly shelved coverage of a groundbreaking study that raises serious concerns about the psychological impacts of diversity, equity, and inclusion pedagogy. Because, that's what media outlets typically do when there's a groundbreaking study on a massively popular phenomenon in our culture and our society, is refuse to cover it because it undercuts popular wisdom. Oh, wait, that's the opposite of what journalists are supposed to do. Anyway, Colin continues that the study conducted by the Network Contagion Research Institute, NCRI, in collaboration with Rutgers University, so not exactly some fringe random weirdos, but very serious researchers. The study found that certain DEI practices could induce hostility, increase authoritarian tendencies, and foster agreement with extreme rhetoric. Those are just a couple minor, insignificant side effects, of course. So basically what they did in this study was they had a control group of people, and then they had a group of people that was the experimental group, where they showed them anti-racist, in air quotes, right, their teachings from the likes of Robin DiAngelo, the author of White Fragility, and Ibram X. Kendi, the author of How to Be an Anti-Racist. And then they asked these people, both in the control group that did not see these writings, and in the experimental group that was given these writings, to analyze situations and see, do you think there's racial bias at play here? And the situation had no actual evidence of racial bias. Important context. What did they find? Well, let's go back to Colin for more on that. The findings were unsettling, though perhaps not surprising to long-standing opponents of such programs. Through carefully controlled experiments, the researchers demonstrated that exposure to anti-oppressive, in example, anti-racist rhetoric, common in many DEI initiatives, consistently amplified perceptions of bias where none existed. Participants were more likely to see prejudice in neutral scenarios and to support punitive actions against imagined offenders. Oh good! What could possibly go wrong with that kind of result? To be clear, this is the kind of thing a lot of us have suggested about DEI trainings and hypersensitivity stuff like microaggressions or teaching about everything through the lens of identity, that it goes far beyond eliminating actual discrimination or racism or teaching equality, all things I think all decent people support, and instead hyperfixates on identity and makes people look at everything through the prism of class, race, sex, etc., and then they start to see victimhood where none actually exists, or they start to see it in every corner from the shadows, and it just creates a toxic incentive structure and pushes these things to the forefront of people's minds instead of letting them fade into the background, which is what we all used to want. And I'm not surprised that that leads to increased division, increased hostility, increased perceptions of conflict where none actually exists. And the effects here, measured in this study, are not small. Colin reports the effects were not marginal. Hostility and punitive tendencies increased by double-digit percentages across multiple measures. Perhaps most troubling, the study revealed a chilling convergence with authoritarian attitudes, suggesting that such training is fostering not empathy, but coercion and control. This is my shocked face. Now, this is important for a couple reasons, one of which is that society collectively has invested billions and billions of dollars into DEI initiatives, and everything from corporate America to higher education institutions to charities and nonprofits, and even our own government. The Biden administration made it a top priority enacting an executive order immediately after taking office, enacting DEI principles at every level of the federal government. This is a massively influential thing that has taken root in much of our society, but at least based on this research, it appears to actually be something that can increase divisiveness, toxicity, and conflict, and also make people more sympathetic to authoritarian ideas. Maybe I'm the crazy one, but it seems like that's something people should know about, that this widely popular program to which we funneled billions of dollars could actually be counterproductive and harmful in some very meaningful ways. And another aspect of this that I find interesting is that in certain pockets of society today, you're really not even allowed to disagree with DEI. I mean, higher education institutions and colleges across the country have DEI mandates that some professors have to sign or agree to or pledge that they agree with DEI principles in order to even teach at the university. So it's like a litmus test for their employment that you can't even disagree with this ideology. And now we're confirming, I mean, most of us suspected this, us critics of the DEI movement have suspected this for some time, that it's actually a harmful ideology. Yet you're literally not allowed to disagree with it and exist in some segments of society today. That's a problem, both just on a fundamental level of academic freedom, but also on just pragmatic reasons of actually people should be allowed to disagree with something that's arguably harmful according to very serious research. And I want to talk a little bit more about the portion of this research where they looked at authoritarianism. In fact, in one passage, they even showed people the writings of Hitler with some of the words switched out and found that after reading anti-racist works, they were more likely to endorse these writings, which is not a perfect measure, but is at least slightly concerning. The same crowd that loves to scream about the resistance and fascism in America and Trump's going to be a dictator and all these things, so while I have many criticisms of Trump, I find hyperbolic and alarmist, also is fully wedded to an ideology that, according to this research, increases both sides, both opponents and proponents, interest and support for authoritarian tendencies. That's not good. And if you're actually concerned about authoritarianism, like I most certainly am, that should bother you. That should give you cause for concern. But instead, mainstream media outlets are burying this study, and it's primarily being circulated through independent media and conservative news outlets. For example, Colin explains the New York Times decided not to cover this study. And I wonder why. Colin writes that the New York Times, which has cited NCRI's work in nearly 20 previous articles, suddenly demanded that this particular research undergo peer review, a requirement that had never been imposed on the Institute's earlier findings, even on similarly sensitive topics like extremism or online hate. So that's an important context to note, that this study is not peer reviewed. Though, unfortunately, peer review has become kind of a joke. You can find lots of ridiculous nonsense that pass peer review. But sure, that's something you look for in a study that this research doesn't have. But that's not the reason they're not. They're making an excuse, clearly, because they've cited them nearly 20 times when the findings are more convenient, and they didn't care about peer review then. It's pretty clear, at least to me, the New York Times is citing that as an excuse to avoid covering something that might upset their readers or run against the agenda they're trying to promote. That's not journalism. That's public relations for an ideology, which isn't really what the Gray Lady is supposed to be all about, but guess it's kind of par for the course these days. And Colin reports that something similar happened at the large business and political news outlet Bloomberg. At Bloomberg, the story was quashed outright by an editor known for public support of DEI initiatives. The editorial decisions were ostensibly justified as routine discretion, yet they align conspicuously with the ideological leanings of those involved. Are these major outlets succumbing to pressures to protect certain narratives at the expense of truth? Colin asks. Obviously, we don't know what's happening behind the scenes, and we can't reach into these people's brains and find their true motivations, but it seems pretty clear to me that that's most likely what's happening here. And to me, this story is just yet more proof of the ideological bias and rot that's so deeply set within mainstream media, and just the death of like the journalistic spirit and curiosity and shit stirring and muckraking that really used to define journalism. Even liberal people who were journalists would like to report a story that upsets people or contravenes a liberal dogma, because that's the kind of personality journalism used to attract, a shit stir, which maybe makes sense that I've ended up in this line of work. But now it's like these people are actually conformists who work in media, who just want to placate people and not ruffle anyone's feathers in their progressive crowd. And to me, that's just totally anathema to like the exciting part of journalism, the fun part of journalism. And this death of curiosity is why independent media, whether it's Reality's Last Stand or the Brad versus Everyone podcast, is on the rise. And I think it will only continue to grow until the mainstream media, whether it's cable news or print outlets like Bloomberg and the New York Times, learns this lesson and stops doing public relations masquerading as journalism. But what do you guys think of this story and of this new study? Let me know in the comments below. Do hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed. And remember, guys, I do take the time to read the comments and I pick a few to respond to in every episode. So do comment with your thoughts. And if you leave your comment with a super chat or a super thanks, I'll definitely respond to it on tomorrow's show. And now it's time for Brad versus TikTok, my daily segment where I take on the craziest ideas from the Clock app.
Pronoun of the day is slugs.
Today, we've got to check in with our favorite TikTok star, non-binary influencer, Jeffrey Marsh, who's back with an uplifting message about connecting with your family and maintaining relationships even when you disagree and modeling respectful civil disagreement and dialogue. Yeah, just kidding. It's the opposite of that. Take a listen and jump scare warning.
Hi, listen.
If I have to.
If someone voted against your humanity...
Because everyone who disagrees with you doesn't respect your humanity. Give me a break, Jeffrey.
You're not going to go home and see them over Thanksgiving. You're not going to see them at Christmas.
Imagine using your platform as an influencer to try to break up families and cause division. Actually, you should be telling people to maintain their family relationships if they're healthy and just don't talk about politics if you can't disagree respectfully. But Jeffrey wants to spread misery with Jeffrey's platform. Also, I don't like to criticize people's looks, but what is going on with this mascara and the eyebrows? I am all about men wearing makeup, I really am, but Jeffrey could use a few tips.
Just because, listen to me, just because someone is genetically related to you does not mean they automatically get your time, attention, respect.
Now, this is true. I agree with this. You don't have to tolerate anything from anybody just because they're your blood and they're your family. But that distinction should be about how they treat you and how your relationship is, not about who they vote for every few years at the ballot box or their political opinions that you might disagree with. It should be about who they are as a person and how they treat others. That's what matters. So it is okay to distance yourself from flesh and blood family if they are toxic, if they are abusive, but not just because they have different opinions than you. That is intolerant, close-minded, and toxic.
And to be more specific, being genetically related to someone does not mean that they get your sacrifice of your respect for yourself.
So if your sense of respect for yourself is so fragile that being around somebody with different opinions undermines it, then I would actually suggest that you lack the confidence and the self-esteem to truly believe in yourself. And that's more the problem, not that other people have a different opinion. So for audio listeners, Jeffrey put text on screen that says, "Coach with me, I'll help." So Jeffrey is now trying to profit off of this Jeffrey operates a life coach business, of course, not really having any real qualifications to do that whatsoever. And I personally wouldn't want to take life advice from Jeffrey Marsh here, but that's just me. So not only are you using your platform as an influencer where you have hundreds of thousands of followers to try to break up people's families, you're also trying to profit off of it. How lovely. And it's not just this one video. Jeffrey has been doing a series about how to cut off your Trumpy family members.
Hi, this is a series about cutting off your Trumpy family members. Why do you need to be perfect? Why do you need to consider everyone's feelings and make sure everyone is okay in the situation and watch what you say and say it perfectly and say it right, while they get to say whatever?
So if that's the case, where there's like really double standards in your family for who's allowed to say what, who's allowed to speak in what way, that's a real issue. But it's not about political disagreement. That's about unfair treatment in the family and an uneven dynamic. And that's a real issue. But again, like, that really isn't about Trump versus Kamala voters. You're making this political when what you're describing is actually a toxic or unfair relationship dynamic, but not really about politics.
They get to be racist, mean,
Oh?
awful to you, not respect your boundaries. They get to say whatever, do whatever, never consider your feelings.
So if a family member is being racist or mean to you, that's a valid reason to distance yourself from them. But simply supporting Trump is not them being racist to you or being mean to you. Disagreement is not a form of discrimination or assault. And guess what? Woke family members are occasionally racist or homophobic or condescending or mean to people in the family who are right-wing and belong to any sort of minority group. And that's also bad. But again, it all comes back to how we treat each other, not our political views. And that is what's important. But Jeffrey is just conflating the two here, really, I think, revealing a closed-minded worldview that suggests everyone that disagrees with Jeffrey must be inherently racist, and that simply disagreeing with Jeffrey is somehow an act of discrimination in and of itself, because Jeffrey's wisdom is just so infinite.
Why do you need to be perfect? And they get to do and say whatever. Does that sound fair to you?
What is with these creepy pauses and just smiling into the camera darkly? Oh, my skin's crawling a little. Again, I come back to this point that Jeffrey has nearly 700,000 followers on TikTok, a very significant platform, and Jeffrey has decided to use it to try to break up families, to encourage people to go no contact with their parents, not just in situations where there's actual abuse happening, which I think can be totally warranted and fair, but just over disagreements or differences in voting. And again, that's so actually insane to me and offensive to me as somebody without a parent in their life. The idea that I would have cut off my dad if he was otherwise healthy and kind to me because he voted differently than me is so insane. And other people who are cutting off their parents over these dumb reasons, it makes me so mad, because those of us without them would love to have a parent in our life and could totally tolerate some civil disagreement on politics. I just can't believe it. And I personally know family members and extended family members who voted for Kamala or who voted for Trump, or some who, like me, voted third party, and nonetheless are wonderful people who I have healthy relationships with. And that's the way you should be operating, and the way that you should be encouraging others to operate, not using your platform to try to break up families. That's demented. Now, I will say Jeffrey gets a lot of hate that I don't necessarily support. Like in this video, Jeffrey responds to a comment telling Jeffrey to eat antifreeze. Take a listen.
May all beings find peace. May every bigot find peace. May every conservative influencer who makes money trying to make us seem evil find peace. May every person who tries to use internet comments to feel more powerful find peace. When I talk this way, people think I'm not being sincere, but I am being 100% sincere deep into my soul. May all beings find peace.
Oh my gosh. It's giving woke crackhead meditation session. Now, I don't support comments telling Jeffrey to self-harm, or even just nasty vitriol towards Jeffrey in general. Keep it constructive. Don't do that in my comments section. It just doesn't help anything to attack people personally, even when they are deeply flawed and suspect individuals like Jeffrey. However, I do find it ironic that Jeffrey talks about other people demonizing Jeffrey, which in this case, Jeffrey is referring to Jeffrey as part of like the trans community, even though Jeffrey's not actually trans, but whatever, that's an aside. And saying like, don't demonize us, don't hate us, just blah, blah, blah. Like that's what you're doing to half the country, Jeffrey, who disagrees with you. That is what you are doing. So I hope you, Jeffrey Marsh, find peace. And I mean that sincerely, because this thing that you're doing, that you're using your platform to advocate for the destruction of families, is one of the least peaceful and most toxic things I've seen on the internet lately. And that's saying something. But you guys let me know what you thought of these videos in the comments below. And do hit that like button to reward my suffering, because I swear when I watch these TikTok videos, I really do incinerate some of my brain cells. So the least you can do is reward me with a like. And now we got to talk politics for a minute, because I've got a bone to pick with incoming President Donald Trump. Trump just announced his new labor secretary, and liberals are cheering for her nomination, which should be a red flag. As recent reports, Trump has nominated Representative Lori Chavez de Remer, a moderate Republican, to be his labor secretary, his secretary for the Department of Labor. She's a moderate Republican, and I don't have anything against her in general, but in particular on this issue, her views on labor and employment policies are in almost complete accordance with Democrats, not Republicans. And she's being applauded and cheered on by some of the most toxic unions in the country. Let me explain all of this and why I find her nomination really concerning. Chavez de Remer, her selection, is being praised by teachers' unions, including the infamous Randy Weingarten, the head of the biggest teachers' union in America. If you're a Republican, a moderate, an independent, a libertarian, or anybody who's not like a hardcore progressive Democrat, that should be a red flag. Teachers' unions fought against the science to keep schools closed during the pandemic far longer than they ever needed to be or was ever reasonable as a precautionary measure. They fight vociferously against school choice policies that almost all Republicans and tons of moderates and independents want and support. But this Republican labor nominee is being praised by teachers' unions. That's a massive red flag. But it turns out that Chavez de Remer is something of a union Republican, something I didn't even really know existed, not in that she stands up for workers like many people on the right do, but in that she enacts policies and supports policies that would please union bosses and in some cases screw over workers or deprive them of their rights. For example, the Congresswoman has supported legislation that would overrule state-level right-to-work laws, which all those laws say is that you can't be forced to join a union or fund a union as a condition of your employment. They protect workers' freedom of association and stop unions from forcibly extracting money from workers who want nothing to do with them. This is a typical Republican position, that right to work is a good thing, and states with right to work laws tend to have lower unemployment rates because it's a business-friendly policy as well, and it draws investment and increased employment, and of course it just protects workers' rights, so they're not forced to fund unions, which are ideological and often donate to Democrats against their will. That's common sense, freedom, free market policy 101, but this Republican Congresswoman who Trump is considering for labor secretary is against it and wants those policies overruled. That might please union bosses because they like forcing people to fund and join their unions, but it's not in the best interest of the American worker at all. Chavez de Remer also has supported the PRO Act, which is a piece of legislation the Biden administration and Democrats have pushed at the federal level, which closely mirrors the policies of California's infamous legislation restricting freelance work and trying to force companies to add people as full-time employees. If this legislation was enacted, it would be devastating for freelancers who advocated and campaigned against California's legislation like crazy. Even people like me would be screwed over because our ability to be independent and pick our own hours and write for different places as we wish without regular schedules or contracts or being employees on staff, all of that would be undermined by our forced reclassification. But of course, it would be great for union bosses because forcing more people into traditional 9-to-5s with the confinement and restricting freelance independent workers means more people will be in union jobs paying union dues. that go ultimately to union bosses. So this pick is very concerning to me because it sends the totally wrong message about a Trump administration's potential economic policy. Part of what made the economy strong during Trump's first term was that he enacted traditional conservative free market economic policies for the most part. Embracing this kind of Democrat, pro-labor union, crony agenda wouldn't be a return to the same prosperity that many Americans voted for. It would be a continuation of the Biden approach to labor and labor unions, which is not what Trump supporters asked for. I hope Trump reconsiders this nomination, and if he doesn't, that the Senate sinks it. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments below. One person writes, I don't always agree with you, but I love your take. As a fellow Michigander, I live in a part of the state where hockey is life. Until puberty, boys and girls play together on the same teams. After puberty, it is almost exclusively a male sport here, for good reason. As a DV survivor, that women's message is extremely horrible and degrading. Keep up the good work, and I wish I could meet you for a coffee and a discussion. Maybe one day we'll do some live in-person events where I can meet you guys. Probably have to grow the audience significantly before we can put together something like that. But no, I agree. It's funny. I saw this tweet from some progressive saying, my kid plays soccer with a trans girl in their 4th grade class, and there's no problem at all. And I'm like, okay, are you familiar with the concept of puberty? It is crazy how much the side that says they're the party of science is increasingly just denying basic scientific realities when it comes to biological sex. Like, they need to get a grip. Another person writes, I've seen Tyson flesh out his views on sports in other forums. He doesn't so much deny sex differences, as he believes we can establish categories based on a range of abilities instead of segregating the sexes. He wants to sidestep the issue. I say he's wrong because he's ignoring the reality and the history of Title IX, which created the women's only category not to belittle them, but at the request of female athletes. He's also ignoring the serious fault in prioritizing the emotional insecurities of a tiny minority over the well-being and thriving of half the human race. Yeah, I've also watched him discuss this issue in other forums, and he says something like, well, we could sort sports by hormone levels or whatever. But again, he's trying to dodge the issue, and what he's saying isn't scientific, because even after even when you adjust for hormones, there are other things that don't change, like bone density, like wingspan, like average height, other things between males and females. It's just, there's a reason these categories exist, and he just seems intentionally obtuse when it comes to this topic and just desperate to defend the woke position. I don't understand why. It's not necessary at all. Another person writes, I wish I had been there when DeGrasse Tyson brought up his thing about women being better than men at long distance swimming. I would have responded to him by saying, it's funny that you should mention swimming because I think perhaps you ought to stay in your own lane. Yeah, it is interesting to me how he's an astrophysicist, which I'm hardly a big science guy, but I think I know what that has to do with, yet also seems very confident in making all these pronouncements about biology and climate change and social science and all these other things. Maybe he should have a little bit more humility about where he's an expert and where he's not. Another person writes, Brad, do you like acting? Woke Hollywood aside, I have this feeling that you have what it takes to be a top-tier actor. I'm not an expert, but I've written for local TV shows in Canada, so hopefully I'm not 100% Delulu. It's not just the charisma. I feel like there's always a little bit of good acting in your reaction videos. Viewers that comment, you have to admit, Brad as the next James Bond would be so based. I actually don't think I'd be a good actor. I don't know. I think I could play myself pretty well. Another person writes, if I worked for the State Department and witnessed all that nonsense, I'd be utilizing that provided therapy to cope with the fact that America is being run by a bunch of snowflakes, and it's only a matter of time before we're going to be bowing to Xi Jinping as our supreme leader, and I'll never be able to buy gas again with my shit social credit score. Dude, same. Absolutely same. My social credit score after doing this podcast and having so much commentary on the record would be horrible. But anywho, the comment continues. Regarding these alarmists saying that black people are going to wake up a slave or that all women are going to be living the Handmaid's Tale, I genuinely wonder whether they actually believe this is going to happen or they're just being incredibly dramatic for clicks. I tend to think that it is a bit of both. A lot of the normal people saying this stuff, and I mean, they're not normal. I mean, like the everyday people who aren't professional journalists or politicians, I think probably do believe it. They probably truly have been scared into oblivion. The media personalities who've covered politics for decades, they have to know it's not true. and just believe, or at least suspect that they're being hyperbolic and just lean into it for clicks or attention. I think unless they have total cognitive dissonance, people who actually know a lot about these things yet still make these pronouncements, those are the ones who I suspect must be lying or must be purposefully exaggerating, because how could they not realize that what they're saying is absurd? Another person writes, I work at Toronto Pearson Airport, and I was chatting with two travelers who lived in Maryland, and of course the conversation turned to Trump. The mother said, oh, The Handmaid's Tale. And because I could see she wasn't open-minded, I had to bite my tongue so hard that there was a new tooth mark there now. The same thing happened when I was chatting with some Swifties who were on their way back from the concert at the Sky Dome. The convo turned to RFK Jr., and because I didn't immediately agree with them, they got all huffy and said, we're leaving now, and walked off. Can we make America mature adults again? Asking as your northern neighbor. This is the first time I've ever super chatted on YouTube. Love you, Brad. Your We'll Talk Again Tomorrow is one of the most comforting parts of my day. My precious service dog, Minnie, likes your voice too. Aw, give Minnie a hug from me. And you must have crazy stories working in an airport. I'm sure you see all sorts of stuff. So thanks for your comment. And yeah, good job on you being open-minded. It's a shame that tourists don't seem to be the same when they head to Canada. Another person writes, denying reality discredits scientists. I played ice hockey with boys until I was 14, and then all the boys became massive and I couldn't keep up. I was 5'5", they were 6'3". There is a big effing difference. Yeah, there is. And that's one of the reasons that this dying on this hill is so dumb for the left. Like, the public sees biological sex all around us. We know it's real. Their position that it's not real is never going to catch on with the majority of the public. It is an insane hill to die on. We just all know it's not true. All right, everybody, that's it for this episode of the Brad vs. Everyone podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Please do make sure you're subscribed if you aren't yet. Do hit that like button before you go, and do remember to comment with your thoughts. I do take the time to read the comments, and I pick a few to respond to in every episode. Plus, if you leave your comment with a super chat or a super thanks, I'll definitely read it on the show tomorrow. And with that, we'll talk again tomorrow.